everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome sports psychologist Dr. Mark Beauchamp to the show. Mark, great to have you on today.
Great, thanks so much for having me, Dan.
Mark, we always start by having guests introduce themselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So, as you'd indicated, my name's Mark Beauchamp, but pronounced actually Beauchamp in the UK. When people ask where I'm from, unfortunately, it's a bit of a convoluted answer because my father was in the Brigade of Gurkhas in the British Army. And so I was born in Hong Kong, lived 10 years in Hong Kong, lived in Brunei, Nepal, Germany, all over the place. But as you can tell from the accent, I'm from the UK, from the southeast. I did my undergrad degree at Exeter, did a master's degree at Queen's University in Ontario here in Canada, and then my doctoral work at the University of Birmingham. And after finishing Birmingham, I was on faculty at the University of Leeds for 3 years, and then have been at UBC now for just over 16 years.
And sports psychologist, I mean, what drew you to sports psychology in the first place?
Yeah, so in my undergrad days, where I was perhaps a little bit more fixated and interested in playing sports maybe than studying sports at the time, but I was really fortunate at Exeter to have some world-class psychology researchers. So Stuart Biddle and Ken Fox in particular were professors of mine, and it was really just being inspired by teachers. And I think, not to wax too lyrical about that, but I think it really, highlights the power of inspiring, engaging teachers and who are research active. And so at the time I was playing a bit of rugby, and I would probably class myself as a very average club player. I played a bit of rugby at Bristol and Exeter when they were in the old third division, and played England universities. But I think I'd really, with retrospect, looking at it, I was quite an average rugby player. But I loved the sport, and I loved the sports psych class that I took with Stuart Biddle in particular. So after university, I played a little bit of rugby, and then I was trying to plan ahead as to what did I really want to do with my life. So I went and spoke with Stuart, and we spoke about the potential of travel and maybe get an education or continuing education through sports psychology. So I was fortunate to get a scholarship at Queen's University in Ontario, and through that I took courses in clinical psychology, organizational behavior, and my eyes were really just opened to the vast range of possibilities that were out there. And then it was really sort of serendipity. I didn't have this grand plan to get into the field or become a professor and everything else. I took a course with a psychologist called Julian Barling, who's an organizational psychologist, does work with leadership, and I was really inspired about potential for transference across different domains of psychology. I mean, we'll talk to this a bit later on, but I think certainly when I got into the field, those who were doing work in sport were quite often looking at the same sort of journals. And I was really open to the fact there's this amazing body of evidence often in other areas of psychology. So really on the back of that, of my master's, I worked with Steve Bray. So Steve Bray, who's now at McMaster University in Ontario, was fortunate enough to invite me to do a doctorate with him. And my doctoral work was on psychology of group processes in sport. So we looked at things such as role perceptions and how they may relate to things such as athlete performance and other social cognitions like self-efficacy beliefs and so on. And it really sort of spiral from there. I mean, initially my work was primarily in sport, and then as the years have gone on, I saw opportunities to see, are there some transference, or can we learn from education? I got interested in the field of behavioral medicine, and I now do a fair bit of work in that area. And I think broadly speaking, I'd really probably characterize my work as really the psychology of human thriving. So we do work on sport performance and athletic endeavor, and I suspect we'll speak a bit about that later, but also very much interested in physical activity participation and the health benefits, psychological and physical, that can derive from an active lifestyle. So my interests are quite broad, and I've really been curiosity driven than say a specific theme driven. I know you probably get advice, or graduate students will get advice to focus on one area and become an expert in that, and I think that's certainly sound advice, but also perhaps as a reflection of maybe my mind all my interests are quite varied. I sort of followed wherever I've wanted to ask questions and get answers to some of those questions that I was perhaps a little confused about beforehand. So I've certainly been very, very fortunate, A, to do work in this field, B, to live and work in Canada at UBC, and really work with some bright, capable, enthusiastic and engaging students and colleagues from across the globe.
About your students, I mean, it's really interesting to hear what you said there, because when I get emails through from young sports psychologists or to-be sports psychologists asking for my advice, one of the things I always say is to read broadly, be curious, engage in divergent thinking. It sounds to me that that's something that you'd canvass as well. Is that something for those young sports psychs listening in? Is that something that you would promote? Is to read broadly, to not become too fixated on the sports psych literature, to read widely across domains, across topics, across professions, I suppose?
Yeah, great question. And I don't think I can emphasize this any more strongly. I'd really encourage this and not pay lip service to it. And I mean, first of all, I think it's a really exciting time to do work in this field. I think there's a number of opportunities if you're interested in applied work or if you're interested in doing research. There's a huge amount of opportunities. But I think where you'll really stretch yourself is, and it's not just for graduate students, I think it's for faculty, seasoned professionals doing applied work and research as well. Read broadly, read across into different areas. There's some fascinating work that's been done in organizational psychology and in medical psychology and education, behavioral economics. I mean, and the list goes on and on. And I think really to push the envelope, and not to get too cliched, but I think if you really want to, it's the old adage, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And if you're reading the same sorts of studies that are quite descriptive and aren't really shedding new light, and maybe it's a new study with a slightly different population, but it really isn't posing or addressing new questions, I think we can get a bit stilted. But I think by reading broadly, you'll challenge yourself, and you may do a ton of reading, and maybe you pick one or two ideas up, but those can really be the catalyst for doing innovative work. I mean, I tried as best I can to sort of practice what I preach. And I think I've done that to some level of success, and perhaps less so in others. But I mean, the work I've done on leadership has drawn heavily from organizational psychology and social psychology. The work that I've done with older adults and group-based interventions has drawn directly from social psychology, but also behavioral medicine as well. So, I mean, one would hope that one is in this because they're inherently interested in doing good work and helping people, and at what level that may be. And I think by really, unless you've really nailed an answer to a question, I think one should always be looking to pursue, are there different ways of looking at an old problem, and maybe that requires delving into a new literature. So, I mean, hopefully simply for intellectual purposes, one would find that would be worthwhile doing, but also from an applied or practical perspective, one can really learn a lot from what's happening in other walks of life.
Mark, as you're speaking, I'm kind of picturing two continuums that are striking each other, that classic sort of plus sign, if you like. We've got one continuum going along that broad divergent thinking or broad divergent reading and research and study. And actually, I've got another continuum in my mind here, striking that continuum, but going from top to bottom. You say you're passionate about the psychology of human thriving, and I'm almost thinking about a mental health well-being, thriving, flourishing continuum here. As much as we want psychologists to read divergently, to cross domains, what's interesting in our field at the moment is there's a lot of conversation, and really good conversation around mental well-being, ill-being, mental health. But I just wonder if we can crank up that conversation around human thriving and flourishing and put that out into the world more, so that other dimension there, sideways and from top to bottom. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a huge amount to unpack in that, but I would 100% endorse that. I mean, we're doing we've done some work with veterans and using a sport-based program, and we're really looking to promote thriving and psychological flourishing as our key outcomes. And I think, and there's also some subtle sort of nuance that goes with this, in that sometimes with certain populations, even just reference to mental health, if you're talking about mental health and physical activity, for some is almost interpreted as synonymous with ill health. So there's a really nuanced and important picture that's being painted. I think it's also a tremendous opportunity for sport and sports psychologists and people doing work in this area to really be at the forefront. And certainly when we're looking at it at professional and elite sport, there's far more recognition in the last few years with athlete accounts, their own personal narratives and biographies around struggles they may have, but also ways in which they might psychologically flourish as well. So with a doctoral student of mine, Jeff Sauvé, has done some work with recently retired Olympic athletes, and I think it's really, we sought to examine what are some of the ways that they understand how thriving or well-being can be supported but also undermined, and there are a whole slew of factors, whether that's intra-individual factors, whether it's organizational factors, and sometimes one would hope that organizations, whether it's national sport federations or what have you, or professional organizations, will do what they absolutely can to support thriving, but sometimes despite the best intent in the world, that doesn't happen. And so this is a very, very complex area, but it's certainly worthy of study. And I think, but it's a great opportunity for folks like you and I and others that may be listening to really be at the forefront of work in this area.
Yeah, we recently spoke to Professor Rosemary Purcell and Dr. Courtney Walton from Oregon University in Australia, and we had a really good conversation around languishing and thriving and mental ill health and mental health, and there's a lot of nuance there and challenges we've got to get the right definitions and to help organisations, especially sports organisations, manage those constructs. And I suppose this mini conversation here is a neat segue into what we're here to talk about today, which is a paper you've written alongside your colleague Alan Kingston and also Nikos Toumanis, who's based in Denmark. That paper is The Psychology of Athletic Endeavour, which immediately gets me excited, Mark. And before we're going to unpack this paper. We're going to dig deep into this paper, but there's, I'd love to know the genesis of this paper. How did this start? Give us, before we unpack it, what's the general overview? Where did this come from? How did it start? And I also believe it's gone into an article that doesn't usually accept sports psychology papers. I don't know if I'm right in saying that. So give us an overarching idea here.
Yeah. Sure. So, the journal, it's in press and it'll be out later this year, advanced online ahead of press, and then it'll come out in 2023 in I think volume 24. So it's the annual review of psychology, and it's since 1950 when its first issue was published. There's been one other paper, Brown and Mahoney in 1984, which was really when the field of sports psychology was a relatively fledgling field. And so it opened up what was happening in the field at the time. There's been one other paper that devoted about a quarter of the article, Anders Ericsson's paper in 1996, but that's over 25 years ago, that dealt with expertise. So it's really designed to showcase different areas for the broad fields of psychology. So the idea, broadly speaking, I was going to say it's a long story, but I guess we've got time to delve into this. But so the idea really came about. So I was invited to teach a graduate class a few years back, and I was really interested in where's the high quality evidence that from a psychology perspective that allows athletes to succeed, to thrive, and to perform well. And and there's as the field has grown, there's just a sheer volume of work that's out there. So it'd be impossible to cover the whole field in any one article. But I was really interested, not just what was happening in the sports psychology journals, but what work was being published in some of the other journals in science more broadly, or the parent disciplines of psychology, that really showcase high quality evidence. So when I mean high quality of evidence, so getting away from correlational cross-sectional designs, where you have problems with common method variants. And I was really interested in, if there have been interventions, what interventions are out there, so that get at things like causality, but also that looks with, beyond student athlete populations, that look at, for example, world-class athletes and professional athletes, and what was happening in the field, and what range of methodologies are being used. And as I just out of intellectual sort of really curiosity, I was finding there's some really innovative work, and then as I got into it more and more, I thought, wow, it'd be wonderful to synthesize this in a body of work. So I put a proposal to the editor at the editorial board at the journal. They asked me to revise the proposal 3 times before they said, yeah, pull the trigger and go and let the sports psych bald fella from England have a go at this article. And then I approached, Alan Kingstone's cognitive neuroscientist, exceptional researcher at UBC in the psych department. So I go running with him on Sundays. And said, hey, do you want to he's done a bit of work in sports psych, but a lot of lab-based experimental work, and I just engaged in general chit chat, and threw the idea by him, and I was also at a conference with Nikos. So Nikos went on faculty at Birmingham when I was finishing my doctoral work, and we've chatted a bunch over the years, and but we never published together. So I approached him, and he's an excellent researcher, really thoughtful man, and does great work in developmental psychology, motivation science, and so on. So I pitched the idea to them, and they were on board right from day one. And so what it involved, I actually structured a whole graduate course around this. So I picked what I thought were some of the coolest papers that were out there, because it would force me to read at depth these papers. In these academic roles, it's so easy to get caught into the day-to-day minutiae and admin stuff. And I really wanted time to devote to reading what's out there and really thinking about and reflecting on what's out there. So I spent about a year working on this paper. So even though the eventual length, it's long for an academic article, I think it's just over 60 pages, including references. But it's, that I'm sure my wife will look at me and would say, hang on, you spent a year to produce 60 pages? What have you been doing? So anyway, I started working on this, and thrashed a few ideas, and some of it was maybe perhaps a little cumbersome and convoluted, and in the first drafts or so, and reworked a little bit. And so it's a really iterative process, and of course, it would be simply impossible to cover the whole field. But what I really sought as an objective with this is to try and shed some light on where is the evidence related to the psychology of human endeavor and performance and striving. But to really look at, where is the corpus of knowledge that's out there that's high quality, and we can't cover everything. And so if anyone's upset that we haven't covered their work, then apologies in advance. So we had to be quite selective. But what became evident in working through this, to me at least, and we took a bit of a sort of a socio-ecological perspective by moving from the individual outwards to looking at the group and the coach and so on. And it was a really fun exercise, and it was a great opportunity, I thought, to showcase the field, show the broader field of psychology, that which may see us as a niche area, but really there's a huge amount that they can learn from us and we can learn from them. So there's an opportunity for cross-fertilization of ideas, and I saw it also as an opportunity to showcase some really, really exceptional work that maybe people haven't seen, because it's published in organizational psychology journals or medical journals or education journals and so on. So we organized it very much from a sort of the socio-ecological piece. We have a developmental piece, and I guess one could fit that as a theme throughout each of the individual, the group, and the coach perspective. But to me, there was some what I saw is actually really quite profound messages from a knowledge translation that were really coming from the data. And so so this is what we try to do, and showcase others' work, and it'd be great to. I'm sure we won't go through it paragraph by paragraph, and it's not a journal club exercise. Maybe your introduction made me feel like I've got to be on my A game, but there's a lot of great work out there, and it's great to be able to showcase the field to the broader area of psychology, and I feel very fortunate that they liked the paper. I was a little nervous. Even once I'd spent a year on this, sent it through, I still thought at any point they could bounce it and say, hey, this doesn't quite fit. But they really liked it. The editors did, and had a couple of thoughtful suggestions. But it was actually one of the more minor revisions I've had to do with any manuscript, which is somewhat surprising given the stature of the journal. So, so happy to delve into and talk about any aspects of it.
Well, it's a fantastic paper, Mark, and it's one as a sports psychology consultant that I know I'm going to come back to again and again, because the themes through it, as you've alluded to, are so pertinent in day-to-day practice, in day-to-day conversations. But I'm going to attempt to sum up what you tried to do in a nutshell, in a single sentence. How does psychology contribute to achieving in sport? Is that essentially what you were trying to ask?
Yeah.
In essence, and what evidence is there related to those psychological contributions?
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of, I guess, sort of addendum or caveat to that, the reason why we framed it as athletic endeavor rather than sport performance or achievement is that I think when you use that language, it's very easy for readers to think of this linear piece. You have this psychological, this thought, this cognition, and then that is related to directly and linearly related to this outcome. But there are a lot of factors, whether there's boundary conditions or moderators or mechanisms through which these things operate. But yes, so you're 100% right that it's about athletic achievement and striving, but it also, and hopefully we'll get at it a bit, is that it's, humans are complex and psychological factors are complex. And so what I think we try to get across is there's no singular magic or silver bullet for this, but there's a complex range of factors that do contribute. But also it highlights that there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. I think it's easy to think, well, we've got this huge amount of information, this corpus of knowledge. We now know how to work with athletes. We now need to know how to work with coaches, and we know a lot about that. But I think we can continue to improve and enhance our practice, enhance our research, and the way in which we translate knowledge.
That's really interesting. So it has a bit of a reductionist versus holistic feel to it, in as much as we're going to appreciate some of these unidimensional factors, concepts, constructs, but we're going to appreciate this within a recipe of multidimensional influences.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And you begin at the beginning. You start with early life developmental experiences and I suppose how they influence progression, engagement, participation in sport. And interestingly for me, you hit on two hot potatoes in the sporting world: early specialization versus diversification, and the impact of adversity on sporting development. I mean, no specific questions here, Mark, to begin with. I mean, can you speak a little bit to early developmental experience, please, and go wherever you'd like to?
Yeah. So to me, there's a huge amount of literature that's accumulated, and it ties to work on deliberate practice as well. But for me, what was really such an insightful paper was, and I hope I pronounce this right, was Gulic and colleagues in 2021. So they published a meta-analysis that looked at diversification versus specialization. And they looked this over the trajectories of athletes' careers, and they compared world-class athletes, so those who won medals and placed in the top 10 at major international championships, and they compared them with national level performers. So they had national team selection, but without the same success as the former group. And I think there are some things that were really quite I think quite profound. I mean, of course, this is looking at collation of data across participants. So, of course, you'll always see an exception to the general trends. But what they found was that those that started their main sport at a later stage, they initially progressed more slowly and with less main sport practice. They tended to do much better in the longer term. So those who specialize early, say in childhood, were often selected for those teams in the teenage years and so on. But in terms of long-term development and success, so we're talking about world-class athletes. I know that the term elite gets sometimes a bit sort of, I wouldn't say mislabeled, but we often refer to sub-elite athletes as being elite. So these are really, truly world-class athletes. And what they found was that this greater involvement, this multi-activity involvement seemed to be beneficial in predicting the trajectories of these world-class athletes. And why I found it's actually really quite profound, and maybe one of the benefits of looking both at the sport literature and the physical activity preventive or behavioral medicine literature, because there is a parallel piece that suggests from a population health perspective, if the goal is to support health enhancing physical activity behaviors, it seems that greater variety or involvement in a range of activities is more likely to get people to stick with those activities. So to me, we often think of the sport performance literature as different from the health and exercise and participation literature. But to me, why this is so profound is that regardless of whether you're interested in broad sport participation and health or elite sport performance, that greater diversification and multi-activity involvement appears beneficial. So whether one is talking to public health folks or national sport federations or elite athletes or parents, who are often interested, how do I support my kid? And my kid seems to be quite talented. Should I have him specializing? And, 4 years old doing X and Y, how much deliberate practice should I be getting, and so on. And if one is evidence informed in the messages we're trying to convey, this is probably about as profound a study. I mean, there's a lot in there to unpack, but if you read the study and the take-home messages, it points to greater diversification. And it's interesting too, they don't spend a ton of time in the paper, but they also make comparisons with the career trajectories of Nobel laureates in physics, chemistry, economics, and medicine and physiology. And they report that they accrue a greater variety of life experiences. And so maybe not to get too cliched, but whether it's, variety really seems to be the spice for an active and a performing life as well. So whether one is interested in sport participation or sport performance, that greater diversification, at least while youth are developing, seems to be a worthwhile pursuit.
Listening to what you're saying there, it almost feels like we could be quite greedy. We can have our cake and eat it. If we're engaged in participative sport and we're motivated by helping young people experience sport in all its glory and all its fun, we can engage them in a process that also readies them for competitive sports should they so desire. Diversification of playing sport, engaging in diverse sports is a recipe for both, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. But so 100%, absolutely. The interesting piece is I think the myth sometimes that whether it's parents or teachers, they tell themselves is, is my kid going to be missing out? He seems to be really good at football, or he's really good at rugby or tennis. Then, am I going to be harming them by also allowing them to play volleyball or go swimming or doing gymnastics and so on? So, and as to why those effects occur, I don't think we quite know that yet. So whether there's cross-domain transference, whether it protects people against burnout because they're using their bodies in different ways. So in terms of the mechanisms that explain why greater variety might derive those outcomes, I don't think we've quite got a handle on that yet. I think one might speculate drawing from different areas. But I think for us as psychologists and as parents and as educators, I think it's an important messaging piece. I think we have a I think we have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, but also certainly professional responsibility to translate findings to the public and make it accessible. And the findings, at least as the current evidence stands, suggest that greater involvement is beneficial. There is some parallel work. So a former doctoral student of mine, Ben Sylvester, did some work in exercise and physical activity settings and suggested that greater variety predicted both retention in a program. So that was a highly controlled experimental study, but also predicted improved exercise-related well-being. So I think there are multiple benefits to this diversification of sport performance and participation, but potentially in terms of flourishing and psychological health that you touched on earlier, Dan.
The second area you spoke about in early life development experience section was the impact of adversity on sporting development. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is fascinating, and so I framed a large part of this on the paper based on the work that Lou Hardy and Tim Rees and others are doing in the UK. So these are exceptional researchers, psychologists doing work in the UK, and they undertook a study called the Great British Medalist Project, and they interviewed athletes who had medaled at Olympic Games, and they compared them with a comparison group who were comparable in many regards, just hadn't had that same level of success. So given that the pool of athletes is clearly very small when you're talking about world-class Olympic gold medalists and so on. So it would be impossible to run a randomized trial and do an experimental study. But what they did do is they interviewed them, and they interviewed parents, and they interviewed their coaches. And these were what Tim Rees and others have called super elite athletes. So not just getting to the Olympics and getting to be a professional athlete. These have achieved the highest levels of success. And they used a combination of interviews and also pattern recognition analysis. So using machine learning based on code that would derive from these interviews. And there's a lot to unpack if you're interested. And it's such a great paper, but it's a lengthy one. The qualitative paper, I think, is over 100 pages. Progress in Brain Science, I believe, that Lou Hardy published. It's a really exceptional corpus of work. But to me, there are a couple of things that really stood out. Is this notion that super athletes were characterized by virtue of this pattern recognition in these interviews by a negative early life event, but also coupled with a significant positive sport experience. So it's not simply that, whether it's trauma or difficult life experience, simply that's what we need to do. I don't think that would be a particularly healthy message to convey, that, we need to create, substantive adversity and leave kids to stew. But what they identified within their data is this negative life event by significant positive experience. So when young kids had something happen in their lives while also having the opportunity to have a really positive experience, it seemed to contribute. And there is some work in personality development that mirrors that. And there's a lot to be still unpacked and examined in this front. We certainly need to do a lot more work on this. I simply flagged that as it was a finding that really was quite striking, and more work needs to be done. But I think one needs to understand the range of human experiences, and one's not always going to be performing at 100%. One's not always going to be thriving. And then, so how does one deal with adversity, and how does one rebound? And so to me, that was a really quite striking finding, and simply put it out as something that's worthy of note. Can we infer causality at this point? No, but certainly something that we should be looking at.
So would you say then, Mark, it's a description rather than an intervention?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth, if we now, what I think it also points to the importance of looking at the life course. It's very easy to, we interview athletes once they've won gold medals or once they become professional athletes, and it's of course it's interesting to understand their experiences at that point. But what it points towards is understanding the life course and understanding what's gone on and what have been the various trajectories, and how have they responded to various life events. And we spoke a little bit briefly early on about the power of teachers, but were there specific people have made a really important mark? I think of Ian Wright, the Arsenal football player. I think it received there was a bit of video for maybe a few years back who talks really, in very emotively about this profound experience of being taught by a school teacher in elementary school, and how that really made a difference. And of course, one can't rely on singular anecdotes, but as one of my colleagues who does work in organizational psychology points towards, you add all these anecdotes up, and it starts to tell a story that's worth investigating. And I think that's what these data that Lou Hardy and their colleagues collected. It points to an interesting phenomena, but certainly something we should look to explore further moving forward.
It's an extraordinary bit of footage, Mark. I don't know if this makes me a very sad man indeed, but I remembered the name of the teacher,
Yeah.
Mr. Pigden, because I've seen it a few times. It's exceptionally emotional, and Ian Wright, who you almost see him, he's looking out onto the pitch, and obviously it's been arranged by the producer of the show for his old school teacher, who he thought was dead, who he thought had passed away, to be there. And he turns round and sees this former teacher who was an incredible influence on him, and he takes his cap off straight away, returns to that sort of subservient childhood mentality and respectful mentality, I suppose I should say, and embraces him, and on it goes. But it's an extraordinary bit of footage.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, the only other thing that I think from a developmental perspective, and that's probably worth sort of flagging too, there is some really interesting sort of innovative work as well that points towards how does one structure sport and the sport environment to really get the best out of kids, especially when they're going through these very, very different developmental types of biological, physical maturation. Obviously, there's work on the motivational climate. Joan Duda and Carol Ames and others have done some really great work on that. But there's some really interesting work that's I know it's done in New Zealand with rugby, but it refers to biobanding. And Bob Molina is really one, and Sean Cumming at Bath, again another UK scholar, who've done some really great work on this, which points towards I think probably when you and I at school, and it was sports or rugby or physical education, as you pick your teams, and obviously the big beasts get picked first because no one's going to run over them and so on. And there are kids who there may be some kids that by hook or by crook get through, but a number fall by the wayside, despite the fact that a few years later, just given the time to grow and develop, may have succeeded. So what biobanding does is it allows kids to participate, especially in contact or physical sports like football or soccer, as they call it here, or American football or rugby. I know in rugby in New Zealand, for example, at the youth level, it's done on the basis of weight as opposed to singularly age. So I think the work in this area is really at quite an early stage, but what it points towards is it's not just those late developers that benefit, but it's also those early developers who are biobanded, with those who are more like themselves. They both benefit in terms of increased opportunities around leadership, participation, and again ties to both retention in sport, and again points to developing that base that allows then people to come through later on. So I think it has both a participatory element but also a sport performance element as well.
I'm probably going to abuse this quote here, but the coaches at AIK, a soccer club in Sweden, talk about as many as possible, as long as possible, as good as possible. Which I think is a great maxim to use in developmental sport. Moving on to the next section, you examine intra-individual psychological processes. You specifically examine perfectionism, self-efficacy, goal motives and goal regulation, and also performing under pressure. Wow, we can go any way you want to here. This is all fascinating. We've spoken on the Sports Psych Show about perfectionism, about goal setting. I'm intrigued to talk about self-efficacy and your thoughts on this. There's some interesting stuff. Where would you like to start here, Mark?
There are so many ways to go. And I should
Yes, there are.
also preface this by saying there are a number of constructs we could have spoken to, and I can explain why we didn't cover some that some people listening may have thought, well, why didn't we talk about grit, or why didn't we talk about resilience, or mental toughness, and so on. So we can unpack some of these pieces. But why don't we even start to maybe the first construct you spoke to? I understand you spoke with Andy Hill earlier about perfectionism,
Yep.
and really the work that he and Tom Curran have done have been really just outstanding. They've I'm sure they spoke to the two meta-analyses published in Psych Bulletin that they've done. The first, to look to the increased trajectories of perfectionism over time, since 1989 to I think 2016, and then the other was, and which is I think also particularly pertinent to this conversation, is the effects of parents and parenting and socially prescribed perfectionism, and so. So I'll not perhaps go at length into this, given your conversation with Andy. But I think what we took from this is really this notion of a double-edged construct or double-edged sword. Is that there are elements, especially around personal striving. If there's perfectionism around personal striving, that it can be facilitated, and evidence within a review that both Tom and Andy did in 2020 pointed to the improvements in achievement, performance, and so on. The problem comes, though, when one has perfectionistic concerns. So that's concerns over making mistakes and negative evaluation of others, and that in particular appears to be particularly pernicious and debilitative. So. And I'm sure Andy would have done a far better job of articulating this than I. But what it points towards is it's a complex construct. There are aspects of perfectionism that are beneficial from an achievement striving performance perspective, but when one overtly fixates on making mistakes and making or deriving negative evaluations from others, it can be problematic. The problem becomes particularly pronounced when we look at socially prescribed perfectionism. The effects in terms of ill health from a psychology perspective, depression, suicide ideation, psychopathology, and so on, are particularly pronounced. So I think certainly as a psychologist, as public educators, and those concerned with knowledge mobilization and translation, we need to be mindful of this. Is that I think the really nice adaptation of this work is Patrick Goudreau's work at the University of Ottawa, who talks about excellencism, and I think that really nicely gets at this notion that it's okay and it's good to strive for excellence and be the best you can be, but things don't have to be perfect, because by definition it's impossible to become perfect, and that can be really crippling, and that one can learn from, and in fact it's healthy to embrace making mistakes, and that's part of the process of becoming a better athlete or a better teacher, a better parent, and so on. So the literature on this is fascinating. There's also some experimental work that's been done in the sport domain that points towards how messages might be particularly problematic for people that display high levels of perfectionism. If we're framing feedback around norm referent comparisons, that can be quite crippling for athletes. So the take home from this is we need to be really careful with the messaging and the communications that we have for our kids, for our athletes, and that's from coaches, that's parents, and to avoid reference to striving for perfect. You can strive for excellence and be the best you can be, but to be 100% with zero mistakes is unachievable, and that can become quite debilitating. So, I think when taken in a nutshell, and I know you have a whole show on this with Andy, but the data on this is fascinating, and that it's aspects of perfectionism can be adaptive, but there are aspects that we really need to be mindful of. In particular, this emphasis on concerns with making mistakes and deriving negative evaluations from others. And there are things that we can do to offset that.
As a consultant, it's really interesting what you're saying, and I also reflect back on the things that Andy said, Dr. Andy Hill, in that episode, helping me understand perfectionism on a more nuanced level. I often speak to people about how perfectionism can push you on, but can exhaust you, can build your confidence, but can create anxiety, can aid your skill execution, but can tighten you to debilitate your skill execution. There's an element of doing some mental gymnastics there, isn't there? And ultimately, that thinking flexibility, that cognitive flexibility, is what we want from athletes.
Yeah.
Self-efficacy. I loved reading this part of this section on self-efficacy, because you do mention that, look, a lot of studies, in very simple terms, a lot of studies promote the importance of self-efficacy within sporting performance. If we want to flourish, if we want to thrive as a performer, as a competitor, obviously having self-efficacy. Confidence could be another term, although I know Albert Bandura, essentially the creator of the idea, the main researcher, said no, it's not confidence. It's more specific than that. But we can call it self-efficacy. Maybe we could call it confidence.
Yeah.
We might think about having an abundance of that, and that's going to relate to high performance. But you kind of say, there's some nuance here. There's some subtlety here. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I've done, starting really my graduate work and my master's work, have done a number of studies on self-efficacy, and it's I think probably one of the most strongly endorsed, I don't think that's too strong a word, psychological construct. In the sport psychology performance area, one needs to foster a sense of self-efficacy. So, and your comment about self-efficacy being synonymous with self-confidence. I mean, Bandura refers to it as situation self-confidence. So, in essence, from a practical sense, we can talk about two as being the same, but there are some subtle differences. And so, you see it regularly promoted in the physical activity domain. You see it regularly promoted in the sport field. You just got to build someone's confidence, and so there's some truth to that in some level, and I'll talk to that. But also, it's to overtly simplify it can actually potentially be problematic, and I'll point to some of the data with it. And what this really points towards, I think, is the evolution of the field that really gets at differences between person analyses and within person analyses. So when you're looking at a population level, when you're comparing across groups, people who on average are more efficacious and more confident will tend to do better. They will achieve more, both in sport, they'll achieve more in terms of pursuing exercise, in educational context, and so on. So that's on a between person level. Where the nuance and subtlety, though, is when you're looking at within person analysis. So you're looking at changes in efficacy relative to where that person's normally at. And so when studies, and including some work in sports, so Stuart Beattie at Bangor and Lou Hardy, mentioned earlier, have done some really interesting work in the sport field, but it's also mirrored by work in other areas as well. And then so when meta-analyses have looked at within-person effects, they found that some studies displayed a positive effect, some displayed a negative effect, and some no effect. And so then the challenge is, how do you unpack that? As to what explains that? And then so as a parallel to some of this meta-analytic evidence, there's some work based on computational modeling. Jeff Vancouver and others have looked at, have presented these very complex computational models, but mirrors what we're seeing in the experimental evidence when one looks at within-person effects. And what this points towards is that an explanation for why you see these different relationships corresponds to whether people have sufficient information to base their judgments. So when people have the relevant information, the feedback necessary so that they're informed about their capabilities, when people are more efficacious, that is related to improvements in performance. But when people simply don't have the information, but they're overtly confident in their capabilities, what it suggests is they don't allocate sufficient resources to plan, to train, and in fact, they're becoming complacent. So not to use too an extreme an example, but let's say someone has had maybe they're inebriated and they have plans to swim 2 miles to an island, and they think, yeah, I can totally do that. I know how strong a swimmer I am, and I'm totally going to crush this. And and unfortunately, ill effects might happen if someone takes that on, or if someone is told by a coach, you've got all the skills, you're so well positioned to perform at a specific level. But if that information is not grounded in reality, one is that athlete's not going to invest the time and the resources to plan properly, and in fact that overinflated sense of self. And from a practical perspective, one would probably refer to this as being overconfident relative to where one should be. So I think when one takes all of this sort of body of information, and it's from sport and other settings as well, education and other domains, it suggests that on average we would certainly look to bolster one's sense of capabilities. We will look to bolster confidence in kids' capabilities. But if that's overinflated and they don't have the information upon which those judgments are based, actually performance might suffer because they're not putting in the time and effort to practice properly and prepare for competition. So I think the answer to it is, fortunately, unfortunately, I think people often like a clean message, but what it means here is it's a complex one. Efficacy beliefs can be beneficial provided that their judgments are based on adequate information. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And I mean, we don't like clean messages at the Sports Psych Show because we know that there is really no such thing, sadly. But what I've written down or drawn, if I was to perhaps naughtily strip things back slightly, is I've written down self-efficacy must be grounded in reality. And branching off of that, skill acquisition, game knowledge, metacognitive skills. As in, if I want to, self-efficacy must bear relationship with skill, knowledge, maybe metacognitive skills. If I want to develop my efficacy, if I'm looking as a coach or as a sports psych to develop the efficacy of somebody in any activity that they want to engage with, that we want to try to align their efficacy with their skill and help build their efficacy based also whilst working on their skills, help them develop efficacy through game knowledge as well, and through just knowledge of themselves, knowledge of how they learn and their inner sense of themselves. Would that resonate with you? Anything I've said there?
Yeah, 100%. And so if one even thinks of, I think, a very practical strategy that I think coaches and sports psychologists and athletes have used is this notion of using sort of self-modeling through video of highlights. And so if one is looking at a highlights reel of someone performing and it's themselves performing, they can see that information conveyed through the video is authentic. They can see themselves. So it's not based on misguided notions of you can do this triple Lutz or whatever maneuver might be in a specific sport, but they can see that the information that's been conveyed is authentic and it's grounded on reality. Now you take the extreme where, I mean, I don't want to maybe point the picture of, say, an unethical coach who's telling a child on top of a 10-meter high board to perform a, multiple move, multiple twist piece, and they've really convinced that kid that they can do this, but that the information that's conveyed is not based on reality, and so then they're less likely going to succeed. Now, of course, that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates that if the information is authentic and it's grounded in reality and it's conveyed that the athletes really believe in their capabilities as a result of that verbal persuasion or illustration of past experiences, that can allow them to succeed. But if that information, that persuasive information, is not grounded in reality, then people are less likely going to prepare properly. They're less likely going to be actually well positioned to execute their skills in the cauldron of competition.
It also makes me think, just dwelling on this a couple more minutes, it also makes me think or reflect back on this reductionist versus holistic notion that perhaps we as sports psychologists need to help coaches understand the holistic nature of something like everything in psychology, but especially self-efficacy, in as much as perhaps there's too many narratives around, oh, well, this player isn't confident. This player needs to work on their psychological confidence, if you like. Go see the sports psych. can be a narrative within a team and organization. Whereas I think it's incumbent on us to help coaches continue to understand that constructs such as psychological constructs such as self-efficacy are holistic in nature. That it is, yes, you can have some psychological techniques that work towards building self-efficacy, but actually it's an all-in mentality here. When you are helping somebody acquire skill, you are helping them build self-efficacy. When you are teaching them something about some knowledge about the game, you are helping them build self-efficacy. When you're helping them learn about themselves, you are helping them build self-efficacy. There feels that coming back to that holistic feel here.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what I would hope a paper like this, but also the slew of others that are out there, I think it's really sort of behoove of us who are doing work in this field to translate those findings. Because if we don't translate this work and these sorts of findings, then people will fill the vacuum that's there, and will fill those with myths and misconceptions as to what the psychological factors are that allow athletes to thrive and flourish. So, if we're talking about something like self-confidence, I think one can convey the value to it, but it needs to be based on reality. And that, I think the Canadian phrase would be to pump someone's tires or inflate one's sense of self. If it's not really grounded in reality, you're not doing those athletes a particular service. In fact, might be harming them. So this is where I think it's about how to properly and effectively convey the nuance within the science that's out there.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, and demonstrable as to how fantastic a section this is. I mean, we could talk all day on this stuff. I know in this section you also discuss goal motives and goal regulation, and you mentioned before that there's surprisingly, I suppose, we're quite sparse in the literature in this area in sport. I mean, we did have some fantastic podcast episodes with Christian Swan on goal setting, and specifically smarter goal setting. Desi McEwen, I know, has done some great work with you on goal setting, and also some great stuff coming out of the University of Lincoln at the moment. We have recently had Dr. Trish Jackman, Rebecca Hawkins on talking about open goals. So actually, funnily enough, we have been speaking quite a bit about goal setting recently. But talk to us about how you approach the literature here in your paper.
Yeah, so for me, this was one of those ones where it was a real surprise in that. So we've done quite a bit of work looking at goal setting in terms of physical activity promotion, and looking at, in particular, studies that have used these highly controlled or randomized controlled trials, and using it sometimes quite complex interventions, and it raises some challenges around, for example, smart goals and in terms of physical activity promotion. So when I was putting the paper together, to me it seemed like a standard starting point. You would go to the goal setting literature, and there would be a voluminous amount, because it's the standard go-to. When one does a basic needs assessment, when one's working with athletes or team, one often then sets specific goals, and we're often told to set SMART goals, specific, measurable, and so on and so forth. And so when I actually looked at the literature, I was actually really quite surprised with the relative paucity of work that's been done on this. There was a systematic review that was conducted quite recently that found that most of the studies were very small in terms of sample size. They didn't really get at what are some of the mechanisms that might account for those effects as to why goal setting might work, and it didn't look at some of the key components. So whether it's in terms of feedback provision, or whether it's whether goal commitment made a difference, and so on. So I think that's one of those ones where sometimes our ideas get sort of tied up to myth and lore, that, okay, we've got it down pat, goal setting works, let's go to SMART goals, and off we go. I think it's probably, at least for me anyway, it was a good point, almost as a point of reflection or pause, to say, okay, let's really look at what's out there. And if we really want to ensure that the strategies we're promoting, and when we're working with athletes and teams work, I wouldn't say we need to go completely back to the drawing board, but I think we really need to start to test our ideas out more thoroughly with better powered studies, proper sample sizes, and pre-registering those hypotheses and pre-registering our analyses beforehand. I mean, there's a whole separate conversation we can get into around open science, but we won't perhaps go down that rabbit hole right now. But I think it does. I think for those who are really interested in supporting athlete endeavor, athlete performance. I mean, given the robust effects that have been found, and I should point out, and we do see that in the physical activity domain, we see it in the organizational psychology literature. But I think it's important that we shouldn't simply infer that the effects we have, that we derive in business settings, are directly transferable. And I think we need to be mindful. Maybe we need to tweak the way we design and deliver these interventions. I mean, even as one example, if one looks at the work in the physical activity promotion domain, the meta-analysis that Desmond McEwen and I did a few years back, we actually looked at whether it made a difference whether goals were self-set or whether they were set by an interventionist. And if one looked, for example, from a self-determination theory perspective, and probably most psychologists would say, of course, they've got to be self-set. People are going to be more invested. But in fact, from a physical activity promotion, and primarily these people were low active or inactive folks, but it didn't matter so much in that if those goals were set by someone else. And so I think rather than simply assume that athletes should set the goals themselves, I think it's worth testing those sorts of questions. Does it matter if athletes are working with coaches, say collaboratively, or if coaches are setting goals for those athletes, especially if athletes buy into those goals? So if they're conveying a sense of confidence in the athlete's capabilities, so their efficacy piece, their other efficacy piece, and they see them as authentic, can coaches actually play a powerful role in supporting goal attainment? So, long story short is, I think there's some work that's been done, but I still think there's a long way to go to fully realize how goals can really be effective in supporting athlete achievement in sport.
What I can certainly speak to, Mark, is as a sports psychology consultant, so much of my work in the goal setting realm is it lends more towards goal achievement theory and motivational climates, and very much in line with really orienting athletes more towards tasks to accomplish, setting of processes, performance processes, if you like, mental skill objectives, that kind of thing, rather than outcome goals, performance outcome goals, KPIs, if you like. That sort of classical approach to help players be self-referenced, task-oriented, focusing on the process, almost cliche stuff now in sports psychology, but perhaps cliche because maybe a truism. But also appreciating that some athletes become motivated through ego, through outcomes and performance outcomes. So certainly no question there, but that tends to be my what I'm doing often with clients, co-creating these solutions, but directing them more towards, I suppose, things that they can control, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're also pointing to as well is separate from goal setting as a cognitive behavioral skill, but also the environment. So you're starting to get at some environmental contextual factors and the way we construct the environments in which athletes are operating in as well. And there's obviously a whole piece around the environment. I mean, we can talk to that, but. The piece around goal setting I thought was interesting. So one is those interventions that have looked at goal setting, but also there's some really interesting work, and really Nikos Doumanis has really led a lot of some really high quality work in this area, and it's looked at what happens when goals become increasingly more challenging, and what allows athletes to really stick with it, that cussedness, and it gets it and really points towards, I think this is really where the value of self-determination theory kicks in, and where people hold autonomous motives that are derived and are not controlled and constrained by other folks. And he's also done some really interesting work. What happens when goals are simply unattainable, when they're insurmountable, and it points to the fact that people who are self-determined and have these autonomous goals or goal regulations will stick with it. But if they find they get to the point that it's simply insurmountable, they appear to have greater cognitive flexibility as well to really think through how to tackle those challenges, or sometimes disengage and re-engage in a different goal. So I think, there's a huge amount of work that's been done on goals in various guises from different frameworks. But I think it also points, to me at least, that there's still a huge amount to be explored, and we shouldn't take everything as de facto. We know everything about goals, because I think there's still a lot that still needs to be unearthed.
Really interesting. And the final construct you're exploring in this section is performance under pressure. You very much examine attention and regulation of stressors as the areas that perhaps mediate performance under pressure, somebody's capacity to perform under pressure. Could you speak to us a little bit about this construct?
Yeah, so this is really Alan Kingston's domain, and I think again this and his contributions to the paper, but I think really also highlights a huge amount of potential to really push the field forward. So broadly speaking, sort of explanations for why people struggle under pressure or choke. Why do they choke under pressure? And under anxiety invoking situations, and there are different explanations as to why people choke. There are distraction focused explanations where people get or direct themselves to task irrelevant information, and then there's this self-focused explanation where attention gets very, very proceduralized, and there's this inward focus. And I'm sure, very much from a practitioner perspective, I'm sure a lot of those concepts will resonate. But what they've looked to do, and a number of researchers look to do, is to look at trying to evaluate a number of different, and I think this is one of the real strengths of the sports psych domain, is that I think performing under pressure, sport is the sort of the prototypical context in which one sees this, and these things are happening in real life. And so there have been a number of strategies that have been applied and have shown some good efficacy. And if one looks at pre-performance routines, for example, as a means of from a distraction-focused perspective, and has found some good efficacy. There's from a self-focused perspective, there's some work on the quiet eye, which I find really quite fascinating. Is this steady and longer gaze, especially when performing execution of specific skills, whether it's free throws, throwing darts, and so on. And then there's some that, to me, I wouldn't say unusual, but certainly those who are less dialed into this literature. There's some work on left hand contractions that have been found, and there was a review last year that found that these left-hand contractions, which are designed to prime visuospatial attentional awareness, and that found some good evidence for efficacy. That said, that the sample sizes tend to be very small and have really been looked at by a small number of researchers. So, and I know there's probably some contention. I mean, even in chatting with Alan, who would say that our attentional focus, aren't derived from very specific hemispheres in terms of right hemispheric activity, that might derive a response from these left-hand contractions. There's often crossover, but I think what it points towards, and they found this with different athletic groups. I know there was some work with badminton, for example, soccer, shooting, or football. Sorry, I've been here too long now. Football, penalty shooting, and so on. But I think what it does point towards is there have been some strategies which have found good evidence for efficacy using experimental designs. I think in moving forward, it'd be really good as well for these studies to be scaled up, for the hypotheses to be pre-registered as well, and also by multiple groups. But it does point towards a range of tools, in essence, that can help athletes, and not just athletes, performers in different contexts, whether it's those involved in public speaking. There's some work also on the use of self-talk as well. There was a meta-analysis a few years back that points towards, in the sport domain, that points to the utility of self-talk as a viable, efficacious cognitive behavioral skill with medium-sized effects. And one of the mechanisms through which self-talk can operate is it helps athletes to direct their attentional focus accordingly. So I think it's a really ripe area, and there's some tremendous research happening, a number of really good work happening in the UK as well. And I think, I mean, as I said, it's at the beginning, it's the performing under pressure piece is sort of ubiquitous if you're thinking about elite athletes sport. The one finding I thought was really, really fascinating, and it ties to the study that Lou Hardy did with their colleagues with the super elite athletes a few years back, and he referred to it as a counterphobic attitudes, where he said amongst the athletes, at least they interviewed, and again, you couldn't be assessed through experimental designs given the very small and elite nature of the population, but they found among many of the athletes they interviewed that they have reported actively seeking out and being drawn to anxiety-provoking situations. And it's difficult to know how prevalent that is, that people, I mean, it almost points to the run to danger piece with when things are first responders. But from an athletic perspective, how prevalent is it that athletes actually seek out and want to embrace those anxiety-invoking situations, who actually thrive in the cauldron of competition, but may find that lower levels of competition may be a bit less stimulating.
Were they anxiety seeking even in situations that were irrelevant to their skills and capacities and capabilities as a sports person? Is it sort of a generic drive towards anxiety inducing situations?
I think based on the data they derived, it's difficult to really nail that down. I think it's more mainly tied to the narratives and the athletes who are talking about competition and
Gotcha.
the Olympics and World Championships and so on,
Yeah.
who for many might find that actually quite crippling. But actually for them, it was something that they actually thrive with really embracing those situations that might cause a sense of anxiety. So I think there's, as a gestalt, when one looks at that literature, is A, it's fascinating. B, we're getting it obviously into interdisciplinary inquiry, sort of cognitive neuroscience, but also sort of social cognitive neuroscience, so the effects of the environment and how athletes perform in different environmental settings, and then evaluating the effectiveness or efficacy of some of these strategies, and also then I think in moving forward, look at how applicable or useful are they amongst, say, pre-elite or youth athletes, and at what age should those sorts of skills be developed, and how effective are they, how much training does one require, so what level of dose does one require, and so forth. So anyway, I think it's fascinating. The other piece, which I'd be remiss to ignore, really, is that this other piece around performing under pressure, which is really from a stress regulation perspective. So one is, I mean, really, these are the two bodies of literature that have looked at sort of performing under pressure, and one has very much taken this attentional perspective, and then there's this parallel piece around performing under pressure and working with athletes to identify stress regulation strategies. So from if we think of it from a sort of a Lazarus perspective, it ties to the appraisal process in terms of what's at stake, what can be done, and then providing with the athletes to regulate the way they appraise various stresses. So reappraising, I think. I know Sheldon Hanton and Graham Jones, years back, both UK psychologists, I remember speaking to, getting butterflies to fly in formation. So whether that's getting athletes to really help them reinterpret their anxiety symptoms as a means of stress regulation. So there are these parallel pieces. The one thing I think probably worth sort of ending on is, I think there's also real opportunity, and I may have missed it, but I don't think I have. But there's an opportunity to blend these different approaches. So, helping athletes with attentional control strategies while simultaneously also helping with stress regulation strategies and reappraisal. And it becomes difficult from an internal validity perspective to identify what might be driving the show. But I think there's certainly the challenge with experimental design. But from an application perspective, I think it's fascinating to really nail down, are there any added benefits by blending an attentional perspective with a stress regulation perspective when helping athletes to deal with performing under pressure?
Well, let me speak to some of that. I've written this absolute goldmine there, Mark, in terms of, I mean, butterflies fly in formation. When we spoke to Lisa Feldman Barrett, the esteemed neuroscientist on the show, she used that as an example, because her work is very much about affect affect, and her theory of constructed emotions, and how we can actually manage our interoceptive processes. So the data that's driving from our body and being interpreted in the brain, actually changing our narrative, our story, and having different concepts for the experiences, the internal experiences we have is very powerful. And she talked about how she helped her daughter change her perception of nerves by using that notion of help your butterflies, or get your butterflies flying in formation. So it very much speaks to, one of the world's leading neuroscientists talking about how that bit of self-talk and that different concept can influence our capacity to manage our inner self. A few more things here that I wrote down as you were speaking. I mean, the Lazarus appraisal stuff, the challenge and threat state. We've had 3 or 4 episodes on challenge and threat, and how appraisal, and then subsequently how, I suppose, self-efficacy and perception of control can influence whether we experience a challenge state or a threat state. Finally, again, as you were speaking, as a former pro golfer, I suppose I'm biased here, but over the last 25 years, I think it's Tiger Woods, irrespective of the challenges he's had away from the golf course, he has been the model golfer who is somebody who, now let's use your notion of, and I love it, of blending this idea of being able to direct our focus of attention and to manage our stress response. He is your archetypal competitor. When he's under the gun, he is doing, as his former coach Butch Harmon said, managing his nervous system. You can see he's walking slower, standing tall. He's going through his routines all the time. On every shot, he's taking charge of himself when it's so easy to let the situation take charge of you. And in terms of not just blending stress management and attentional strategies, but also narrative, when you listen to him speak, he says after, that was fun. And I'm thinking, man, I couldn't think of anything more terrifying, trying to hit a golf ball, even though I was doing it 8 hours a day in front of 1 billion people watching. So there's this interesting blend, Mark, of narrative, attentional direction, and stress management. Blend, I think, is superb.
Very well said. I couldn't have said it any better myself. So, yeah, great.
Showing my geeky side there. Listen, that's so fascinating. That the intrapersonal side of things. Moving on here, group processes. In the next section, I mean, obviously we know a lot about, or we speak a lot in sport about teaming, teamship. We spoke to Desi McEwen a few weeks ago about work that you've been involved in with him. Talk to me about this section here, group processes and athletic achievement.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a real focal area of my work. I mean,
yes.
Groups are so ubiquitous or pervasive across life domains and certainly sport. We see, even if one is looking at independent activity, golf teams and so on, if you look at the Ryder Cup, teamwork and team processes are really quite salient. So, and I've been fascinated in this for a number of years. So I was fortunate before he passed away to work with Bert Caron, who was a mentor of myself, and did some work early in graduate school on cohesion. And and they did some fascinating work looking at the different components or dimensions of cohesion. And a few years back, I was really interested. So where's the evidence that if you target cohesion, does it derive performance outcomes? And Luke Martin, so at Queen's University, did a meta-analysis a few years ago, and some of the insights were really interesting. So they looked at strategies like group goal setting and so on, and the effects on, actually, although they're able to derive effects in terms of team performance outcomes, they were found very little to no effect in changing cohesion. So to me, that was suggesting there may be other factors at play. So that really got me thinking and delving into some of the organizational psychology work with Desmond McEwen. So that's why we looked at teamwork, especially delving into that business psychology literature as a set of behaviors. So what are the things that actually teams do? And within that literature, it points towards cohesion and things like collective efficacy being emergent states that stem from the behaviors that they do. So to me, it started to point at, it's lovely to have groups that are cohesion, but what allows groups to be cohesive and what allows them to function? What are the actual tangible behaviors? Because that, I think, can provide some guide for intervention, because it's all well and good sending a, team off for a retreat and, golf retreat, or having a couple of beers or something, and they may have fun, but it may not fundamentally change, the interpersonal dynamic. So, that's what really got me hooked into this. And perhaps even as a complement or maybe a precursor to this, I was interested in the piece around team composition. And you hear the old adage of getting the people on the right bus and in the right seats, and getting the people who perhaps shouldn't be on the team to step off the bus, and so on. So I was interested in things such as team composition. And there's been this fascinating analysis of data based on objective measures from professional sports. And there was a really quite prominent study in psychological science a few years back that pointed towards, or ostensibly pointed to perhaps that you can have too much talent on a team. And in fact, if you have too much talent, then the effects might become negative. And what was interesting at that time, it paralleled some work in social psychology, organizational psychology, around what they referred to as a too much of a good thing type effect. And there were people that were writing books, their pieces in the Atlantic and the popular media, and then that started to become embraced within management consulting about, well, you've got to be careful of having too many stars and so on. And then what was really interesting, a couple of years ago, there was a reanalysis that extended this data set, and then looked at, I believe it's around 60 seasons of NBA data. Yeah, 64 seasons of the NBA, and they look at these objective measures in terms of assists, points, and so on. And what they found through that reanalysis, the previous findings were really a methodological artifact by virtue of using quadratic functions rather than log functions. And what they found that when you get too few data points beyond the apex of a curve, and not to get too mathematical, but if you think of a normal distribution and then you look at the extreme, that when you get too few data points, they suggested this ostensive negative effect was more a methodological artifact. And this reanalysis by Gula and colleagues found that you can actually never have too much talent. That's not to say the effects are perfect and linear, but what it suggests that adding more talent to a team is beneficial, but you still need to work, because you get that curvilinear relationship. It points towards communication type process, interpersonal processes that one needs to function on. So to me, what this really points towards is the real utility of using these big data sets from sport, which are based on objective measures. So it's not based on self-report, and accumulates this data over time. So anyway, so that was the starting point, which is this, I think just worth recognizing that if one looks at it then from a practical perspective, it suggests that yes, you want to get the best talent you can, but of course you need to work on these interpersonal processes, which on the one hand seems like very, very straightforward, not rocket science, but what it does point towards is a cautionary flag with a narrative of saying you can have too many talented athletes on a team, which was a message that was being pushed within the organizational psychology only a few years ago.
And so, am I hearing you correctly that actually there is some evidence to suggest that, provided that you're given the opportunity, you cultivate the opportunity to work on interpersonal qualities such as communication, actually that notion of you can have too much talent is actually a myth, as long as you get the opportunity to work on those factors?
Well, there are a couple. So one is there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the data, but and again, this is one very large data set with one set of analyses, and in their data they don't find any support for that relationship turning negative, but it is curvilinear. So what it points towards, as you add more talent, then the effects in terms of performance start to dissipate and start to wane over time, but they don't turn negative to the point where it actually starts to become negative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it kind of it evens out, rather than, it doesn't actually create a worse team, it just doesn't necessarily keep creating a better team.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Exactly.
And I suppose, just think, given my experiences looking from the outside in at various teams, might think of, say, Paris Saint-Germain in soccer
Yeah.
right now, or teams I've worked with whereby there's been, I suppose one could suggest that there's been a perception of an enormous amount of talent in that team.
Yeah.
I, I suppose the challenge feels like the greater the talent level, if you've got 8 superstars in an 11-a-side team, then maybe quite often what you find is those superstars are less willing to work on those, what we could construe as softer skills, the interpersonal skills, and so therefore it becomes more difficult to improve a team with more stars.
Yeah, so I think that maybe a simple analogy, but let's take the Paris Saint-Germain example, or
Yeah.
let's say some of those teams that have finished in the top, I don't know, 8 in the Premiership. And I don't want to offend
No,
anyone.
no.
I know that football's quite a passionate piece in the UK, but if one picks, say, a team that is stacked with let's say, a very expensive pool of athletes. So the club has got tons of money; they've invested in it, and so they're always going to be in the top 8 or so simply because they have that talent.
Yes.
But what it also means is that talent alone is not going to get them to win the Premiership and so on. It requires those other pieces as well. So simply stacking a team with multi-million-dollar players will ensure survival. You'll finish in the top half of the table. So what it's saying is that team talent's not necessarily problematic. In fact, it's beneficial, but you need more than talent. You need some of the other pieces at play. You need the teamwork. You need some of the, we can talk about social identity and efficacy, contagion, those sorts of things. So it points towards the fact that talent is beneficial, but it doesn't point to the fact that it actually will become negative simply by having talented athletes on the team.
Well, Mark, it feels like, you've mentioned those magic words of social identity. It feels like it might be more difficult. The more good player or talented, ultra talented players that Paris Saint-Germain buy, it feels like it would be more difficult for their coaches to influence social identity, to help those players feel a sense of belonging to the club when they are superstars. That, I suppose, that to the layperson, that's how it feels.
Yeah, well, you tied on. Distinct but related body of work around social identity, and this is really a huge growth area, and,
Yes.
and there's so many people doing work to identify any specific individuals. But there is some really great work which points to these social identity processes. Catherine Franson, who's at the University of Leuven in Belgium, has done some really interesting work, that experimental work with sport teams, and that's really, really hard to do experimental work, with sport teams. But what they point towards, and it ties to the coaching piece too, but they did work where they had athletes who are confederates in these teams, and they did this with football as well as basketball tasks. And they had these confederates display heightened levels of confidence in their teammates, and then by virtue of showing that I believe in you, you've got this, you can do this, that fostered a shared sense of social identity, that sense of belongingness, and that thereafter had demonstrable effects on athlete performance. So it points towards this sort of mechanistic piece, and there's some work that points towards coaches having this effect as well. But what's interesting too, we often think of coach or sport leaders as being coaches, but this also points to the capacity of athlete leaders. So when athletes, are on teams, and they're the ones on if you use the example with football, but if they're the folks on the field of play, and if they're demonstrating, not through sound bites, by real authentic communication of, we've got this, I believe in you, we can do this, then it seems to foster this sense of belongingness that thereafter translates into those athletes performing at higher levels. And I think what's I think worthy of note with this is all of these factors that one needs to consider. We started with team composition and talent, but I am pleased we spoke to these other pieces, because the talent piece, of course, you need athletes with talent, but you need these other factors at play as well. You need coaches and athletes that are showing that they believe in you. You need a sense of belongingness, and there's a growing body of work that points to social identity and the sense of belongingness that drives athletes to succeed and allows them to flourish psychologically and thrive.
While this can act as a neat segue to the final, to a short discussion around your final section here, which is coaches as catalyzing agents of athlete engagement. To finish off this review of your fantastic research here, Mark, can you talk a little bit to the influence of coaches on athlete engagement?
Yeah, so maybe we can even just draw briefly from your mentioning before of motivational climates, and there is some work that points towards when coaches are able to foster mastery or task-based climates where the focus is on self-reference improvement, on getting better, and not overtly, ties a little bit to that notion I think you mentioned of controlling the controllables too, not fixating on others, on other teams and how their lineups stack, but focusing on what you have control over, focusing on your team and getting better relative to where you're at beforehand. So there are some very practical tools, and this is an area which I think has quite a robust body of evidence in the sport domain, and it sounds like you're using it in your day-to-day practices. And the beauty of this is that these aren't things that are just limited to elite professional athletes. These are things you can do and start with at a really young age with athletes too. So yeah, so and the other piece too, I think we need to be mindful is that the coaches can also have negative effects on athletes and their teams if they don't pay attention to these things. And it's not that it's rare that there's coaches are stepping onto teams and there's an absence of any sort of effect. They're often driving an effect amongst their athletes, whether it's engagement, whether it's participation, whether it's enjoyment. But if one looks at it to the flip sides, and when one sees quite aggressive or abusive behaviors as well, that can have really quite persistent effects on athletes over time. I mean, we did a study with research at Queen's University in the business school where we looked at the trajectories of when coaches were engaging in ostensibly quite abusive behaviors, and we were able to look at the extent to which athletes themselves engaged in those sorts of aggressive sorts of actions, so through penalty minutes and so on, and also performance indicators, so using objective performance indicators. So I suspect it's not rocket science to many, but if one looks at it at a very general level, coaches matter. I think we started the conversation with that teachers matter, and I think if we look at these together, these social agents in our lives, and I think we can include parents. We should include parents in that as well. These key social agents have a really important effect on athlete development, on athlete achievement, and certainly their engagement and psychological health.
Coaches matter not just because of their knowledge and their expertise, but also through the environment that this is what I'm hearing from you, the environment that they're creating, and the behaviors that they're displaying.
Yeah. 100%. One sees it within the counseling psychology literature as well, and that if one differentiates the content of an interaction that one might have between a psychologist or a counselor and their client or patient, and if one distinguishes the content, from the relational aspects, and what one tends to see, and we've seen this in the literature going back quite a few years now, is that the quality of relationships really, really matter. People are far more likely to engage. So one can have a highly knowledgeable and technically astute coach, but if they're not paying attention to those relational processes, they can very quickly undermine any sort of credit in the bank that they may have from all this technical expertise.
Coaching is tough, right?
It's really hard, and teaching's tough, and parenting's tough, and I think also one is probably worth bearing in mind that we can't be saints as parents, teachers, coaches all of the time. But if we go into it guided by a philosophy of being guided by principles, doing what's right because it's the right thing to do, and think of how are we trying to develop a climate. If it is a mastery-based climate we're trying to develop, what are the guiding principles that we're going to use to ensure that there's a focus on getting better and self-referent improvement. So and I think that's one of the great strengths of our field, is that there are these real practical skills and frameworks that we can use to guide what we do.
Here, absolutely well said. You finish the paper by discussing the future. What does the future look like?
Oh, the $1 million question. I think the way I see it is, I'm always mindful of that old adage: you know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. But I think there are the way I see the field going in sports psychology, I think we can have a glimpse at what's happening in a few areas, I think, to provide a few clues. And to me, one of and there are some practical pieces and there's some data analysis pieces. The one I think that really speaks to where I think the field. I think if there's some bright sparks out there that really want to carve a niche, I'd be inclined to look at the just-in-time adaptive interventions. So these are interventions that are developed that are tailored to specific individuals at the right time that they need them to have the maximal effect. So we often will develop interventions, say we'll develop workshops, we'll develop maybe a whole program, and we might do a pre-post, we might do a randomized controlled trial. But rarely do we evaluate interventions on a continuous time or an ongoing basis. And we're starting to see this in the preventive and behavioral medicine literature. So, for example, if there are specific it may be an app-based intervention, so delivering messages or specific supports by specific people at the specific time that they need it. So if they're paying attention to when they might be struggling, that would be the point to intervene, as opposed to giving a one-size-fits-all workshop. And I think it happens on these sorts of interventions, whether we call them an intervention or whether we just call it coaching. But this happens in sport regularly. If we think of coaches delivering specific messages in the middle of a game or a match to derive an effect, whether it's to calm the team down or to make them feel more confident. But we rarely evaluate these specific or micro interventions at the time that they're happening. And I think that there's with data and analytic methods that are now available, so continuous time, longitudinal modeling, which makes use of intensive longitudinal methods. So this is where we collect tons of data over time, and we can do that over a day, over a week, over a month. But I think there's a real opportunity. We know that a lot of the pro-psychological processes we deal with in sport and other settings are really dynamic. They fluctuate, they ebb and flow in response to a conversation, in response to wins versus losses, in relation to maybe a fallout from a coach. And so, but we rarely capture these sort of in situ specific experiences. And I think there's a real opportunity, given advances that have been made in data analysis, to analyze these specific sorts of interventions at the specific times that they need them, that are targeted to specific people. I think it's really exciting. I've not seen much of it in sport, but if people are interested and they really want to carve a niche, look to the preventive and behavioral medicine literature, because that work's starting to unfold. And I think it points to our really early part of the conversation about reading across other domains. So I think we can learn from what that's happening around machine learning as well, and indeed this analysis of continuous data over time. So to me, that would be the starting point. I think a lot of the literature that we see, and I've probably been as guilty as any, is that the samples, the populations we study tend to be very weird, and that's not weird in a pejorative sense. It's weird. So Jen Henrich, who was at UBC but's now at Harvard, coined this term weird psychology. So Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic. So we tend to, you see very North American, very European, Australian, New Zealanders. We don't often look at non-weird samples. Yes. And we make assumptions that people think in the way that we think. I think it's human nature. But yep. If one looks at cultural psychology and insights from cross-cultural psychology, we do see differences from different parts of the world. And I think if the field is to evolve, to really fully understand the human experience, I think we need to get out of our comfort zones. And it's hard doing this work, but it means collaborating with people in different countries, from different cultures, using different methodologies to really understand. And it's very easy to assume that we know where things are at based on a Western perspective on psychology, but there's a huge amount of opportunity to learn from other cultures' context other than our own. So I think those would be some really quite substantive areas as a starting point.
Mark, just so fascinating, brain exploding emoji there. Just so much detail, so much information, and some really fascinating thoughts as to the future direction of sports psychology. And I know a lot of coaches out there would be most grateful for us to do some research around in the moment intervention and the efficacy of contextual intervention and trapping that data. So just I can't thank you enough for taking the time to come on and talk to you about this really, really important article, this research paper. I think you mentioned at the beginning of the show that actually it's not out until the back end of the year. So I'm not too sure if they're going to have to be patient, I'm guessing. But look, if that's the case, tell us when you think this will be out, when people will be able to read it, and if it taps and it will tap the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience, how can people follow you and follow your work and maybe even get in contact?
Great. Well, first of all, Dan, thanks so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. In terms of the article itself, so we've made a preprint available on ResearchGate. So if people want to get it before it hits the press, they can do so beforehand. Obviously, it hasn't been copy edited. So if anyone spots any typos, let me know and I'll fix those in the proofs. And then the online ahead of print version, I believe, was coming out in the summer, and then the with page numbers comes out in 2023. So that's, I believe, it's issue 74. So they have one issue per year, and that's the 2023 version. So and if people want to follow me, they can do so at Mark R. Beauchamp on Twitter, and if people want to email me, so they can. Just go to UBC and type in my name, and feel free to email me if they have any questions, concerns, comments. All are welcome. I think it's important that as a field we engage in discourse and thrash ideas around. And if we disagree with one another, that's great. Let's thrash some of those ideas out. And I think it's how we all learn and get better and improve, with really supporting who our stakeholders and our clients are, which is really about athletes, exercisers, and the population which we support.
Absolutely fantastic. Well said. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode.